Hello and welcome to Unacademy IAS English, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. Welcome to another episode of NCERT Fundamentals. Under this series, we are covering all the important NCERT textbooks and the most relevant chapters which are useful for our prelims and mains examination. So today is the fourth session for political science and international relations. Today we are going to discuss India's nuclear policy and the evolution and the foundation of India's nuclear policy. This is part of the Class 12 textbook on politics in India since independence. Under this NCERT textbook, we have chapter number 4 that deals with India's external relations. In fact, under this chapter, we have already covered the evolution of India's foreign policy, especially the foundational principles that were laid down by Prime Minister Nehru. We've also discussed India's conflicts with China and Pakistan. And today, we are going to talk about India's nuclear policy. Before we start, do join my Telegram channel. You can scan the QR code. I'll share the link in the description as well. And this way, I can share some updates and notes with all the students. So let's begin the discussion and let's start from the very beginning. As you all know, today India is a nuclear power, not just in the civilian domain, but we also possess nuclear weapons. So it's very important to understand the origin of India's nuclear weapons program. Because right from the beginning, India has always been a peaceful country. In fact, India was even championing nuclear disarmament after independence. So then how come India started pursuing nuclear weapons? How come we carried out 2 tests to display our nuclear weapons to the world? What were the consequences of this? That is what we will study and understand in this class, which will give us a comprehensive idea about India's nuclear policy and nuclear doctrine. So if you look at Prime Minister Nehru, Nehru was someone who believed in science and technology. Right from the initial years, under the 5-year plans, Prime Minister Nehru gave a lot of support for science and technology initiatives in India to ensure that India becomes a hub of science and technology, be it our scientific institutions and be it the research organizations. Many of them owe their origin to the days of Prime Minister Nehru. Similarly, the Department of Atomic Energy would essentially get the blessings of Prime Minister Nehru to put India on a nuclear path. But initially, India's objective was to develop nuclear technology only for peaceful purposes, which was only to explore the civilian dimensions of nuclear energy. But gradually, as the global geopolitical circumstances developed and as we faced a lot of security challenges, India would eventually diversify its nuclear program and focus on development of nuclear weapons as well. So in 1950s, Prime Minister Nehru would bless India's nuclear scientists led by Dr. Homi Jahangir Baba to initiate India's nuclear research program. In fact, if you trace the origin, even before independence, in the 1940s, there had been some element of support for research in basic sciences, particularly in physics, including nuclear physics. Post-independence, the Nehru administration would back Homi Jahangir Baba, the BARC as well, Baba Atomic Research Organization, and the Department of Atomic Energy to put India on the nuclear path and to harness nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. Because Homi Jahangir Baba was a visionary leader and a scientist. He realized the potential of nuclear energy for a populous country like India. Through nuclear energy, we could solve our energy problem and thus ensure security for agriculture, manufacturing, etc. So when Homi Jahangir Baba led this initiative and proposed the idea to Nehru, Nehru was more than welcoming of the initiative. And as India started its domestic nuclear research, we even got some foreign support. We got some support from Western countries. I know this might be a bit shocking because later, the very same Western countries would target India and isolate India over its nuclear program. But I'll come to that a little later. So in the initial years, in late 1940s and early 1950s, India's nuclear research which was in its nascent stage, would receive support from Western countries like Canada and United States. As part of cooperation between developed and developing countries, under the Colombo Plan and under the Atoms for Peace initiative, both Canada and US would assist India in civilian nuclear technology. Canada even gifted a nuclear reactor, which would be India's first nuclear reactor. The US would even supply nuclear material to India and assist our civilian nuclear research. So these countries were always hoping that India would never focus on weapons and India would just focus on the civilian aspect of nuclear energy. But in 1960s, the circumstances started changing for India. We started facing serious security challenges, particularly from China. Because if you look at Prime Minister Nehru and his global vision, he always championed the cause of nuclear disarmament right from India's independence. Because in 1945, when the Second World War came to an end, the whole world had seen the destructive consequences of nuclear power when the US dropped nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So ever since, Prime Minister Nehru had been a champion of nuclear disarmament. He had been urging all the global powers, from Soviet Union to UK, France, and of course the US, to push towards nuclear disarmament and to get rid of nuclear weapons in the world. Because nuclear weapons had triggered an arms race. The Cold War rivalries had begun between the US and the Soviet power bloc. This had led several countries to pursue nuclear weapons research, and the then nuclear weapon states had already started accelerating their nuclear weapons program. So global tensions were increasing. So in this context, Pandit Nehru kept pushing for nuclear disarmament. But however, the global arms race continued. India even showed commitment in the initial years for non-proliferation, which was to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons technology to other countries. But as we entered 1960s, and as we faced a significant security threat from China, India's approach towards nuclear technology started changing. By late 1950s, the People's Republic of China had created multiple border issues with India. Tensions were building up between both the countries, and in 1962, China went to war against India. So this was a critical point in our nuclear program. India suffered a crushing defeat in this war against China, and this led Homi Bhabha to be convinced about the need for nuclear weapons to ensure that India can protect its strategic interests. Because nuclear weapons, they have always been strategic weapons which can establish deterrence. If you possess nuclear weapons, it will help you establish a deterrent against those who are threatening, who are being hostile to our country. So Homi Bhabha's vision was that we should no longer limit our nuclear research to civilian energy, but we should diversify and focus on nuclear weapons and make India a nuclear weapon state. Because that was the only way India could protect its security and strategic interests. By then, the PRC tested its nuclear weapons in 1964. So this added further momentum to the push that Homi Bhabha was giving for India's nuclear weapons program. He would meet Nehru, try to convince Nehru, but since Nehru was initially committed for nuclear disarmament and believed strongly in peaceful application of nuclear energy, he was not completely supportive of a weapons program. But as China tested nuclear weapons, and as India-China tensions persisted, it became a necessity for India to begin its nuclear weapons research. So right before Prime Minister Nehru passed away, he sanctioned India's nuclear weapons program under the leadership of Homi Jahangir Bhabha. Institutions like BARC and Department of Atomic Energy would lead the initiative. Then under Lal Bahadur Shastri and later Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, a greater push was given, especially under Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, to accelerate India's nuclear weapons research, and India would eventually test a nuclear weapon as well in 1974. So by 1960s, India had been secretly pursuing a nuclear weapons program. By using the nuclear reactor and the nuclear materials that Canada and US had shared with India, which was meant only for civilian purposes, India was trying to reverse engineer the technology, and we were trying to divert the civilian material towards the weapons production and weapons development. So Canada and US became aware of India's secret pursuit of nuclear weapons. The American intelligence agency, CIA, was closely tracking India's nuclear weapons program, and both US and Canada started bringing pressure on India to abandon its nuclear weapons program. And this is what led the global powers to bring in the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, primarily to contain India and other such countries which were also thinking about developing their own nuclear weapons. So these global powers, essentially the P5 countries, the permanent 5 members of UN Security Council, which included United States, Soviet Union, UK, France, and China. Back then, China at UNSC was not represented by PRC, not by the communist government. It was represented by Taiwan. So these 5 permanent members of UNSC, they would push towards the implementation of Non-Proliferation Treaty from 1968 onwards. Now this treaty was highly discriminatory according to India. Now that PRC had tested nuclear weapons and it had joined the elite club with US, Soviet Union, UK and France, these 5 countries which had a self-interest to protect their nuclear weapons, they brought out this treaty called NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The objective of NPT was to prevent the further spread of nuclear weapons technology. While the overall intention seemed to be good, the problem lied with the provisions of NPT. The NPT, which was brought out in 1967 and eventually brought into force in 1968, it basically read that P5 countries are the only official nuclear weapon states, which meant these 5 global powers could retain their nuclear arsenal. They could even expand their nuclear program and even continue to build and test nuclear weapons. But however, the other countries, the non-nuclear weapon states, which did not possess nuclear weapons by 1967-68, they will face a restriction. If they accede to Non-Proliferation Treaty, if they sign and ratify the NPT, it essentially would mean that they will have to promise, they will have to commit under international law to never pursue nuclear weapons. If they already have any weapons program which has been going on, they will have to shut down those nuclear weapons program in exchange for civilian cooperation. In exchange for cooperation from the P5 for receiving civilian nuclear technology with regard to electricity generation, the medical applications of nuclear energy, etc. So this would mean the end of nuclear weapons program for countries like India. So clearly the NPT was discriminatory. It was designed to protect the elite P5 countries to retain their nuclear arsenal and even expand their nuclear arsenal. Whereas it would prohibit other countries, the non-nuclear weapon states, from continuing their nuclear weapons program. So many countries accepted NPT. Many countries which were committed for a nuclear-free world, which were committed towards nuclear disarmament, they accepted NPT voluntarily and they permanently gave up any pursuit of nuclear weapons. Countries like South Africa, they even shut down their nuclear weapons program, which was in its early days, and they accepted the obligations of NPT. But India, maybe in an ideal world, would have accepted NPT because even we believed in a nuclear-free world and even we were championing nuclear disarmament at that point. But the ground reality, especially in our neighborhood, wouldn't allow India to sign a discriminatory treaty like NPT. Because China was an immediate neighbor. China had border issues with India, it had fought a war against India, and it already had tested nuclear weapons, it possessed nuclear weapons. So it was absolutely essential, it was a strategic necessity for India to deter China by building its own nuclear weapons. So the weapons program which had been initiated under Homi Bhabha and Prime Minister Nehru would continue covertly for a few years, and we would face significant pressure from the global community, especially the P5 and particularly from the US. It is said that Soviet Union would discreetly back India's nuclear weapons program, but the others would pressurize India to ensure that India abandons its pursuit of nuclear weapons. So this indeed became a challenging period for India, because by 1971, the US had become openly hostile against India during the liberation of Bangladesh war. The US had favored Pakistan in the conflict and had even threatened India with military consequences. So as India aligned with Soviet Union during the liberation of Bangladesh war, we basically gave up on the principle of non-alignment. In the midst of the Cold War, we had remained non-aligned until 1971. But during the course of the liberation of Bangladesh war, because of the hostility shown by the United States, India was forced to side with the Soviet Union and sign the Treaty of Peace and Friendship, which essentially meant that we were giving up on the principle of non-alignment. We were aligning with the communist power bloc led by Soviet Union. And this meant India and US and India and the Western countries were now on the opposite sides of the Cold War. So the pressure from Western countries kept on increasing, and it further pushed Indira Gandhi to ensure that India would develop its first nuclear weapon, and we tested those weapons as well at Pokhran in Rajasthan. This secret mission was called Operation Smiling Buddha. So this was a very rudimentary nuclear device that was detonated. This was more of a symbolic statement from India. Even though it was not a fully functional nuclear device, this limited nuclear test did put India on the nuclear map, and it sent a very strong message to the world that India will continue the pursuit of nuclear weapons for strategic reasons. So India boycotted the NPT entirely. India said it's a discriminatory treaty, it's not fair, and given our strategic reality, the concerns that we face from China, the constant threats from Pakistan as well, it was an absolute necessity for India to develop nuclear weapons. So this policy was guided by strategic realism, by pragmatism, instead of idealistic principles. So India accelerated its secret pursuit of nuclear weapons through the 70s and 80s, and we eventually faced global isolation. Especially after 1974, after Operation Smiling Buddha, the US would keep a close watch on India's nuclear program, and according to several credible reports, it even tried to undermine India's nuclear weapons development. And this led to some sanctions being implemented on India. It led to economic restrictions on India, particularly from the Western countries, and at the same time, there were many economic crisis situations that were affecting the world and India, which led to economic turmoil in our country. Around the same time, the global oil crisis occurred because of the 1973 Yom Kippur War between Israel and the Arab powers. This impacted global oil markets, leading to a significant rise in oil prices. India being an import-dependent country with regard to crude oil, we bore the full brunt of this, and as a result, it led to inflation in India. It increased the transportation cost. Our energy security was under threat because we weren't able to procure oil supplies, leading to a major economic situation. Within the country, there were many agitations going on, including the nationwide railway strike within the Indian Railways. So all these external and internal economic challenges eventually led to economic turmoil in India, and this was the price India had to pay for the pursuit of nuclear weapons. So the global factors did play a role in the eventual economic crisis that we would face. The pressure from US, the global isolation that we were facing because of our pursuit of nuclear weapons outside of non-proliferation treaty did create these economic challenges for India. So India had to overcome these difficult circumstances to eventually develop a full-fledged nuclear weapons program. Throughout 70s, 80s and 90s, the United States made several attempts to target and derail our nuclear program and even the space program of India. Because I hope you know, there are many interlinkages between the nuclear sector and the space sector, especially when it comes to delivery systems. When it comes to delivery of a nuclear warhead, countries will require ballistic missiles, and the same technology has a civilian application in the space domain. So while ISRO was leading our rocket development, the development of our launch vehicle, the other institutions like Department of Atomic Energy, BARC and others, they were leading weapons development, nuclear weapons development. So according to many reports, the US was covertly targeting our nuclear and space program, trying to derail them in order to ensure that India will never procure the technologies that were required. The sanctions had affected India's ability to procure nuclear material and nuclear technology that was readily available. The only way we could do it was covertly, and most of it had to be done indigenously. So this was indeed a very difficult and challenging period, and yet India came out successful at the end of it. We withstood the pressure, we boycotted NPT repeatedly, and in the 1990s there was another treaty proposed called the CTBT, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. This treaty called for a complete ban on nuclear testing, be it underground nuclear tests or underwater nuclear tests, or even nuclear tests conducted on land or in the atmosphere. In any medium, nuclear testing would be prohibited if CTBT would become operational. But India and many others, they boycotted the CTBT as well, because this again was discriminatory. If the P5 countries could retain their nuclear arsenal, why would it be fair for India to accept these restrictions to not test nuclear weapons? The same line was followed by Pakistan as well. As India began its pursuit of nuclear weapons, obviously Pakistan was also driven to begin its own nuclear weapons program. And this is where countries like China would directly back Pakistan's nuclear program. China has always seen Pakistan as a proxy against India. To counterbalance India and to counterbalance our nuclear weapons program, China would start leaking nuclear secrets to Pakistan. It would secretly supply the designs and even nuclear material to aid Pakistan's development of nuclear weapons. And the United States, which was aware of this, which was aware of the secret nexus between China and Pakistan, would remain silent, because for US, India was a threat at that point. The US believed if Pakistan also becomes a nuclear weapon state, then it could be a counterbalance to India. Because US Pakistan were aligned together, especially in 70s, Pakistan was their closest ally. In the 80s, Pakistan would assist US in Afghanistan to train the Afghan Mujahideen to fight the Soviet forces which had occupied Afghanistan at that point. So they were like-minded allies, they were on the same side of the Cold War. So even when US knew that China was in violation of NPT, it was aiding nuclear leakage to Pakistan, the US remained a blind spectator deliberately to ensure Pakistan could become a counterbalance to India. So these were just some instances to highlight the American attempts to derail our nuclear and space program. There have been several allegations as well that the United States even attempted few assassinations targeting Indian scientists. But we are in no position to verify the claims, but the allegations are quite strong enough. Especially the death of Homi Bhabha is shrouded with a lot of conspiracy theories and criticisms, which leads one to believe that there might have been a foreign hand, a possible foreign hand involved in the attempt to ensure that Homi Bhabha is taken out of the picture. Well, let's not fall for the conspiracy theory, but at least it's important to acknowledge the existence of such theories and claims. So in short, throughout this period, several attempts were made to derail India's nuclear and space program. But eventually, by 1990s, India's nuclear weapons program had matured. Under P.V. Narasimha Rao, India's nuclear program was fully prepared, and India was trying to prepare for a nuclear test, a second nuclear test, to clearly establish nuclear deterrence against China. Because displaying your capability is crucial in order to establish deterrence. But when India made the preparations, the Americans, they got wind of it, and they would bring tremendous pressure on India to abandon the nuclear tests. So after several failed attempts, finally in 1998, under Prime Minister Vajpayee, India successfully carried out the second Pokhran test, which was codenamed as Operation Shakti. India managed to hoodwink the American intelligence agency. Its satellites and its vast network of intelligence sources were successfully evaded by India, and eventually we tested nuclear weapons at Pokhran again, and this time it was a comprehensive test by India. So this clearly put India on the nuclear map and established India's nuclear deterrence in many ways. But however, things were not so simple. Things got even more complicated after this. Because the moment India tested nuclear weapons, this was again a violation of Non-Proliferation Treaty. Because even though you're not a signatory to NPT, still developing and testing nuclear weapons was outside of international law. So this led to economic and technological sanctions targeting India. So US and many other countries, including Japan, because Japan has a strong commitment for nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. Japan is the only country in the world which has suffered the horrors of a nuclear war. Even though Japan was a friendly country to India, it couldn't support our nuclear program because of its ideological commitment against nuclear weapons. So several Western powers and other countries which were committed to a nuclear-free world, they joined the US to impose these economic and technological sanctions on India. So this came at a time when Indian economy was just coming out of the economic crisis of the 1990s. So it hurt India's economic interests again. And more importantly, we could not procure critical technologies which were readily available, from semiconductors to even cryogenic engines, which was crucial for various sectors in India. We could not procure the readily available technology as India was kept out of all these export control regimes. So this would continue, and parallelly, we would face a serious challenge from Pakistan. Because obviously India's nuclear test in 98 was a threat for Pakistan. Now that India had established deterrence against China, it would give us dominance over Pakistan as well. So Pakistan retaliated within a couple of weeks after Operation Shakti and conducted its own nuclear tests. So as I mentioned earlier, throughout the 80s and 90s, Pakistan had got tremendous support from China, and Pakistan was also involved in further proliferating nuclear technology to other rogue countries, from North Korea to Libya to Iran. So Pakistan, which had accelerated its weapons program, would test its nuclear weapons as well within 2 weeks of India's nuclear tests, leading to an arms race in South Asia. So obviously the tensions increased between the two neighboring countries. And mind you, this was the first time ever in human history that two hostile neighboring countries were possessing nuclear weapons. This had not even happened with US and Soviet Union. And the very next year in 1999, we even fought a limited war, the Kargil War. This was the first time in human history that two nuclear armed rivals were fighting a conflict, which never occurred even between US and Soviet Union. So clearly the arms race was on, the tensions kept piling up, and the US kept pressurizing India and Pakistan to tone down the tensions. So we had to deal with a lot of geopolitical consequences as a result of India's nuclear weapons tests. But in the end, it was all worth it, as it established India's deterrence against China and secured India's interests. But at the same time, don't forget that India is a very responsible nuclear power. India has always followed its commitment to non-proliferation. We have never contributed to the leakage or spread of nuclear technology, unlike Pakistan. So we had a commitment to clarify to the world that our weapons were meant for peaceful purposes only. Now, you might see this as a contradiction. Usually, the word peaceful doesn't go with nuclear weapons. But that is exactly what India called it. When Prime Minister Nehru blessed Homi Jahangir Baba and initiated the weapons program, and later even when Prime Minister Indira Gandhi approved Operation Smiling Buddha, India's official statement eventually was that these were peaceful nuclear tests. Even after Pokhran-II, India said it was a peaceful nuclear test. So this is like an oxymoron. How can a nuclear test be peaceful? Right? But that is where you need to understand the nuances in India's nuclear policy and nuclear doctrine. We don't intend to use our nuclear weapons. We don't intend to be the aggressor in case of a nuclear war. These nuclear weapons are only meant for deterrence. They're only meant to protect India from a first nuclear strike. So to establish this clearly to the world, the Vajpayee government came out with a nuclear doctrine. And India declared a no first use policy, meaning India will not be the first country to use nuclear weapons against an aggressor state. So India's nuclear doctrine states that India will deploy its nuclear weapons only as a second strike option. Meaning if some country, hypothetically, maybe China or Pakistan, if such a nuclear state has attacked India with nuclear weapons, only then India will retaliate with a secondary strike. And to ensure that we never get to this situation, we seek to establish credible minimum nuclear deterrence. Now, these key words are very important, because what is the point of having nuclear weapons if someone is already launching a first strike on us? Right? I think that's a question all of you will have in your mind. To establish the deterrence, to ensure that we don't become a victim of a first strike, you need to prove your second strike capability. The enemy should know the consequences if ever they use nuclear weapons against India. So once we achieve that state of deterrence, the enemy will not dare launch the first strike. The first strike will never happen because you would have established a strategic nuclear deterrence. So through the nuclear doctrine, we promised credible deterrence, meaning established deterrence, which means established second strike capability. That is why we have pursued the nuclear triad status, which means we can deliver nuclear weapons through all the mediums, through land, water, or even the air. So we have ballistic missiles from Prithvi to Agni, which ensures a land-based deterrence, which means we have multiple options to launch nuclear weapons through land. Then through air, the Indian Air Force has modified some of the fighter jets from Sukhoi 30 to Mirage to the others, which are capable of carrying nuclear warheads and delivering nuclear warheads. So that comprises our air option. And coming to underwater, right? You need submarines which can carry nuclear warheads and ensure that they can avoid detection, which means your regular conventional submarines will not do. Diesel electric submarines, they are usually not very stealthy because of the noise, the heat signature, and also they have to come up to the surface frequently to take in oxygen to recharge the batteries. So what you need to really establish a nuclear triad is a nuclear powered submarine which can carry nuclear weapons on board. So recently we have achieved the triad status as well under the INS Arihant class of submarines. These are nuclear powered submarines which India is developing and inducting, which will carry nuclear ballistic missiles on board that guarantees a second strike from India. Because in a hypothetical nuclear war game situation, right, if you think of a hypothetical situation, imagine there is a first strike on India and India wants to carry out a second strike, and India promises a devastating second strike. The problem is the enemy will not simply launch one or two nuclear warheads. They will try to take out your second strike capability because they know that a second strike is coming. So they will focus on your land-based delivery systems, which is your missiles, which can be taken out, which can be identified by the enemy and they can take it out in the first strike. Even your fighter jets, which can deliver nuclear weapons as a second strike, they can be identified and they can be taken out. But for the enemy, it will be difficult to identify the location of a nuclear powered submarine because nuclear powered submarines have a much longer life underwater. They can remain underwater for months together without surfacing, which means they are more stealthier, more harder to detect. And as a result, your nuclear weapons which are on board a nuclear powered submarine can survive a first strike, thus guaranteeing a second strike from India. So that is why achieving the nuclear triad status was so crucial, which we have done recently through the INS Arihant class of submarines. So with this, India has established credible deterrence. We have guaranteed a second strike. We have displayed our second strike capabilities. Now, what do you mean by minimum? Minimum means that India will not blindly expand its nuclear weapons program. We will only develop and possess those many warheads and delivery systems which are necessary to deter our imminent threats, which is China and Pakistan. That is why we have lesser nuclear warheads than even China and Pakistan. If you look at the number of warheads which are projected to be held by these nuclear weapon states, India has lesser warheads than even China and Pakistan. Why? Because we don't need to get into an arms race. We don't need maximum number of warheads. We need the minimum that is needed to ensure a second strike on either of our enemies, which essentially means that India is not interested in an arms race. We are not interested in building tensions further. We will just build the minimum number of warheads and delivery systems which is necessary to deliver a second strike. And that is how we maintain the credibility of a second strike, and that becomes your deterrence. Once the enemy knows that there is a guaranteed second strike coming from India, they will never dare launch the first strike in the first place, thus establishing the deterrence against the enemy. So that is how India has established its credibility in the nuclear domain. And of course, things underwent a transformation in the early 2000s. India-US relations started improving from 2001 onwards. We even signed a civilian nuclear deal with the United States in 2004-2005 that cemented India's position. Right? This was one of the biggest achievements of the then Manmohan Singh government. So the US recognized the credibility of India's nuclear program and signed a civil nuclear deal with India. Now this was the biggest turnaround. from a country which was hostile to India, which was openly targeting our nuclear and space program, which was imposing sanctions on India at one point, to closest defense partners who had signed a civil nuclear deal. This was a complete transformation in India-US relations. So as US recognized India's nuclear status, it even promised India to help India enter the export control regimes. It lifted the economic and technological sanctions. It helped India to join some of the export control regimes such as the Missile Technology Control Regime or MTCR, the Wassenaar Arrangement, Australia Group, and it has even been supporting our entry into Nuclear Suppliers Group, the NSG. Today, most countries are backing India's entry into Nuclear Suppliers Group. Even Japan, even the other major powers, they're all supporting India's entry into NSG as they recognize India as a responsible nuclear power. India agreed in return to separate its civilian and military reactors and facilities. We signed all the agreements with IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, and opened up for inspections of our nuclear facilities. So that is how India has shown its credibility, and thus we have maintained a balance with regard to establishing a strategic deterrence against the enemies, while assuring the world that our weapons program is meant only for peaceful purposes, to maintain the peace, not to disturb the peace. This is what you learn from this important chapter. And also note, we have a well-established command and control structure to operationalize the nuclear doctrine. If ever we were to get into a nuclear conflict, there is a clear-cut structure which has been set up that functions under the civilian leadership. Eventually, it will be the Prime Minister of India who will be the decision maker about India's second strike options, if ever India is attacked by nuclear weapons, right? So maybe we'll cover this in another class, because that is not exactly the mandate of this particular session. So we will look at India's nuclear command structure maybe in some other session, but do know that we have a well-established command control structure. There is a special command, a SFC or a Strategic Forces Command, which is a tri-service command, which maintains control over India's nuclear warheads and as well as the nuclear delivery systems. So all the assets of the Army, Navy and Air Force, which are nuclear capable, they're all placed under the SFC, which is a tri-service command. Eventually, it reports to the CDS, the Chief of Defense Staff, which is a newly created position. The CDS is the highest ranking military officer, right? So SFC will always work on the orders of the Nuclear Command Authority, which has been established, which is headed by the Prime Minister. So within the Nuclear Command Authority, there is a political and executive council. The political council is headed by the PM, of course, with the top cabinet ministers, essentially the Cabinet Committee on Security. So it consists of the Home Minister, Finance Minister, External Affairs and Defense Minister. And there is an executive council headed by the National Security Advisor, along with all the top officials of all ministries and key organizations. So the NSA will provide the executive, the official advice to the political council. Eventually, the PM will take a call whether India will use the nuclear option or not. So the nuclear button in India lies with the Prime Minister, who heads the Nuclear Command Authority. Once the orders are issued, the SFC, Strategic Forces Command, will have to blindly execute those orders. So there is a very clear and a very safe command control structure in India, and our nuclear doctrine also is widely recognized and appreciated around the world. So on this note, I would like to bring my discussion to an end, but let's take a practice question. Examine the challenging circumstances under which India was forced to develop nuclear weapons. So for such a question, what you should do is provide a good introduction. Start with the very origin, the evolution. Point out how India under Prime Minister Nehru was actually interested in a nuclear-free world. How we were focusing only on peaceful users of nuclear energy. Then in the body you can discuss the circumstances which pushed India to pursue nuclear weapons. The threat from China, the threat from Pakistan, and eventually the global pressure created by the US. Right? Then discuss the development and the testing of weapons in India, and conclude the answer by stating that India is a responsible nuclear power. We have never contributed to a nuclear arms race. We have a clear nuclear doctrine with certain commitments, and we also have a well-established command and control structure. So that completes your answer. So let's see how many of you can write a good answer for this question, and please post the answer in the comment section. Now look at a practice prelims question. Which of the following statements are correct? 3 statements have been given. Let me know the answer in the comments or join my Telegram channel where I'll post this question. I'll give you the answer and the explanation. Is that clear? So please pause the screen, read the statements carefully and give me the answer in the comments. If you don't know the answer, join the Telegram channel where I'll post the same question and I'll give you the correct answer. So on this note, I would like to complete the discussion. I hope you guys understood everything and I hope you guys liked the session. Do let me know in the comments, do press the like button and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. That is it. Thanks for watching. NCERT books are unavoidable to crack the IAS exam. Not only is the content of these books authentic, but these books also help a civil services aspirant to build conceptual clarity. And most importantly, lots of questions in the civil services examination are directly asked from NCERT books. But the aspirants often find it difficult to cover these books, or worse, they even end up ignoring these books. We at Unacademy IAS English are going to make the reading and understanding of the NCERT books easier. We present NCERT Fundamentals course, a free initiative of Unacademy IAS English. What are the highlights of this program? Comprehensive coverage of the most relevant NCERT books for the civil services exam. Prelims and mains practice questions in each session to test your understanding of the fundamental concepts. This course begins from 12th of July every day at 6 p.m. right here on our YouTube channel. Subscribe to the channel now.